This is the Comics Alternative for young readers. Reviews of Musnet, The Mouse of Monet, Bird Boy Volume 1, The Sword of Mali Mahi, and Poppy and the Lost Lagoon.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers. I'm Andy.
And I'm Gwen, and we're two people with PhDs talking about comics.
And on today's podcast, we are going to talk about 3 new books for you. Musnet, The House of Monet by Kickliy, and Bird Boy, Volume 1, The Sword of Mali Mahi by Szabla, I believe is right.
That's right.
I've got it in my notes too.
Yep.
And then we're going to finish with a book called Poppy and the Lost Lagoon by Kindt and Hurtt. So we've got 3 really, really interesting books to talk about today.
That's right. We have to be world travelers, don't we, Andy?
We really do. I mean, we're talking. We're going to talk like a lot of different cultures. We're going to talk. My French is not so good, so Gwen, I might rely on your French.
Oh no,
expertise.
The entire nation of France is weeping right now.
The only French words I can remember I can't really say on the podcast, so I'm gonna
oui.
Oui. And c'est dommage, which would apply to my understanding of French quite a bit. So we're gonna have a great time with that.
Yeah.
But before we get to those titles, we'd like everyone to know that this episode of the Comics Alternative for Young Readers is sponsored by Discount Comic Book Service. Go to DCB Service, that's dcbservice.com, for all of your pre-ordering needs. There you will find DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles for 40% off. The other publishers you're going to find deals ranging from 20 to 35% off. Sometimes specials that are 45 to 50% off the cover price. And sometimes, Gwen, hard as it is to believe, the discounts are more impressive than that.
This is true, and in fact, this month there are 2 really great kids bundles that I want to tell folks about. The first one is the Marvel bundle, and it has a number of awesome and, in typical Marvel style, extremely long titled texts on sale. So the ones are Marvel Universe Avengers, Marvel Universe Avengers Ultron Revolution 2, Marvel Universe Guardians of the Galaxy number 11, and Marvel Universe Ultimate Spider-Man vs. the Sinister Six number 2. You get all that comics goodness for under $5, for $4.47, which is 50% off the cover price.
Wow.
I know. And then for the DC bundle, we have Looney Tunes number 232. So, folks, your grandparents were hopefully they held on to number 1 because you could go to college on that. They have Scooby-Doo, Where Are You, number 72. And Teen Titans Go, number 17. And these, again, are all for $4.47, which is 50% off the cover price. But wait, Andy, there's more.
There's more?
There's more. They also have Szabla's Bird Boy Volume 1 for $5.99, which is 40% off list price. And they have Kindt and Hurtt's Poppy and the Lost Lagoon for $8.99, which again is 40% off the cover price. So these 2 great titles that we're talking about today, you can certainly get at a deep discount.
That is a steal for both of those books. That is really good news.
Yeah.
Well, Gwen, we have a little bit of convention news. First of all, I want to tell our listeners, of course, once this goes up on the podcast, the convention will be over. But right now, Derek and Andy Kunka are at Heroes Con in North Carolina, and I know they are having a great time. I've been keeping up with them on Twitter, seeing their tweets and the pictures and things like that. And, I don't know how many of these creators they're going to be talking with, but there are a lot of young readers, creators down there. Andy Runton, who does Owly, is there.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. David Peterson, who does Mouse Guard, which is an awesome book. He's there. Ben Towell, who does one of my favorite books from last year, Oyster War, is there. Erica Henderson, who does Unbeatable Squirrel Girl, which is an awesome book.
Beyond awesome.
Oh, it is so good. And actually, two of the creators that we're going to be talking about, Brian Hurtt and Matt Kindt, are there. And also Cara McGee, who does Over the Garden Wall. So there are all kinds of great creators at this convention. And, if again, this is going to go up after the convention is over, but, I want to encourage parents who might live nearby a convention, even if it's a small comics convention, take your kids and you might get to meet some of these creators whose books you really enjoy. And there's nothing like meeting one of those creators. Even if it's not somebody that's a really, really big time creator, just talking with those creators about, what's the process like of creating a comic or drawing a comic or scripting a comic. It is such an interesting thing, really, regardless of your age. It's just so much fun.
Yeah, and a lot of times, comics creators will draw comics for kids right on the spot, or when they sign the kids' comics, Andy, I just had that happen to me. Actually, I'm going to do a fangirl thing here for a minute, but I finally got to meet Jean Luen Yang in person, the author of American Born Chinese and Boxers and Saints and Secret Coders, and he drew this awesome robot in my copy of Secret Coders, and I'm not even a kid, so if you had brought your kid, it probably would have been even more exciting. So it's really, really cool for kids to go and to get to see people just doing the drawing in real life. For me, it's even fascinating. As a person who would like to be an artist but really isn't, it's so exciting to watch someone draw a really complicated scene just in a few minutes. It's so cool.
Yeah, it really is. So I encourage anyone who has never been to a convention to find one in your area. And, especially this time of year, there's a convention every weekend somewhere. And there's probably one close to you. So, Gwen, speaking of conventions, you recently went to a different type of comics convention. Can you tell us a little bit about what you did the last couple of weeks?
Well, I'm really fortunate to be part of the Children's Literature Association, which is the major scholarly body for the study of children's and YA literature. And this year, our conference was themed around the idea of animation. So it could be anything from cartoons to comics to even the concept of animation. And it was held at The Ohio State University. And what was really exciting was the guest speaker was Jean Luen Yang, and he gave 2 talks. I attended both of them. They were amazing. And in fact, when Secret Coders 2 comes out, if we decide to review that, I can give you a little bit of inside information on that comic. But it was really great. I want to sort of do a shout out to a couple of my friends. One is Dr. Michelle Abate, who is a professor at Ohio State and a member of the Children's Lit Association. And she was the host for this, along with her graduate student, Carly Grice, who's getting her doctorate at OSU and is writing on comics. And both of them together did a really great show at the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library, which is on the campus, called Good Grief, Children and Comics. And the reason why I want everyone to know about that is in conjunction with that exhibit, which if you're in the Columbus, Ohio area, you really should get down and see, because they've pulled out from the archives some of the first Snoopy comics, some of the Nancy comics, just all sorts of really cool children's comics. But what's even better is Michelle, along with Dr. Joe Sutliff-Sanders at Kansas State, has co-edited a series of essays on children's comics to go along with the exhibit. And guess what? Those are available online for free.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, so if our listeners want to access those, they can basically just Google the Billy Ireland Cartoon Library. And when you do that, click on exhibits. And from there, click on the Good Grief. It'll be really obvious. It's the only exhibit they're doing right now that focuses specifically on an overview of children's comics. And right there is a wonderful link to all of these great essays. I'm just going to tell you a couple of them. One of them is by my friend Annette Wanamaker, who's a professor at Eastern Michigan, and it's her paper is called The Great American Graphic Novel, Jeff Smith's Bone and Its Influences. So I know a lot of our listeners probably really like Bone, and would be really excited to read more about the sort of things that inspired Jeff Smith. And there's a wonderful essay on called "Let's Go Exploring: Illustrating Childhood Development" and Calvin Hobbes by James Curtis, and just a whole host of other really neat essays that are very accessible and I think would be really exciting for our listeners. So I wanted to let everyone know about that. And then secondly, one of the nice things about this conference is we always have a keynote address. It's called the Francilia Butler Keynote. It's based on the woman professor at University of Connecticut who helped found the field of children's lit. And in her honor every year, there's a lovely talk. And this year we had Dr. Charles Hatfield, who's a professor at California State University, Northridge, and Dr. Joe Sutliff-Sanders, who's a professor at Kansas State. And together they gave a talk that was called Bond Time or Solo Flight, Picture Books, Comics, and the Independent Reader. And I want to mention this, Andy, because a lot of our listeners, I know, really have enjoyed the Toon comics that have been put out by Art Spiegelman and Francoise Mouly's publishing imprint. I think you and I have talked about hopefully someday being able to review some of those comics. And basically, Charles and Joe were talking a lot about whether or not the chaperoning process that occurs when parents and children read picture books together, or adults and children, librarians such as yourself and children read comics together, versus the idea of are comics also meant simply for solo readers, or can parents chaperone their kids through comics? And you and I have often talked about, the way that comics make a great bonding experience for adults and kids. I think when we did Hippopotamuster, we had talked about that John Green's book would be really great for parents to read with their kids. But what Charles and Joe did was something that I really hadn't thought a lot about, but they went through and Toon has basically hired someone to go through their comics and make sure that they are basically set up for different categories of readers. And so if you go into the store and pick up a Toon comic, if you flip to the back, it tells you basically what things an early comics reader can pick up, and all the way through until someone's an independent reader. So they sort of take you through those steps as a parent. And on their website and in the books, they also give advice to parents who might read comics to children. And basically, I think what Toon Comics is trying to do, and this is especially something that I think Francoise Mouly is very interested in, is teaching kids to read comics early on so that they can grow up to become adult comics readers. And I think that is just a wonderful initiative. And I so enjoyed Joe and Charles' talk. And so I thought I would just share those little things with you. It was a really great conference. There were countless panels on many of the comics that you and I have reviewed this year. And so it was wonderful to go and to listen to other people's reviews and discussions about them. And maybe next year we'll both get to be there at the same time. But it was a lot of fun.
Well, it sounds like a lot of fun, and I certainly do want to come to that next year. And, Gwen, that is a very important point that you bring up about the readability of comics and picture books and everything else. In the library, we have a lot of people that will come in and they'll say, I'm looking for a book to read with my son or daughter, or to my son and daughter. And that is a distinction. Is this going to be a book that this child is able to read independently, or are you reading it to them at this point and have them read it independently later on as they develop? Those are very important things. And like you said, Toon Books is doing an awesome job of making all of that material available to parents.
Right. And also, we don't want, and I think most parents don't want to keep their kids from reading a comic that they're interested in if it's at a Lexile or age level that supposedly is higher than where they are at. Right. Because as we both know, very often the way that kids learn best is to have challenging material that they have to ask a lot of questions about. But I also think it's really helpful, especially if parents or other adults who are working with kids haven't had that much experience reading comics themselves, then not only that resource from Toon Graphics, but also the resource from the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund and their wonderful resources online with teachers' guides and everything just make comics that much more accessible to the general reader. So, yay.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, there's so many great resources out there now that, at one time it was kind of difficult to find exactly what you're looking for, and it was a very frustrating experience. But there's so much out there now, and hearing about your experience at this conference is making me, not only want to go to the conference, but to be excited about all the things that are coming out.
There's so much to read and so little time. That is the problem, isn't it, my friend?
That is the problem.
Yes. All right. Well, hey, we have 3 exciting comics to talk about.
We do. And Gwen, would you like to introduce our first book?
Absolutely. The first book I'm really excited by it for this reason. In the past, one of the things that I've sort of bemoaned is that sometimes it takes years for a really good comic that has been released in France or in Belgium to make it over in its translated form to the United States. There's often a lag, sometimes of years before that happens. But I've noticed recently that more publishers are choosing to publish books simultaneously in the United States and in Europe, and to publish them in translated editions almost immediately. And that's what's happened with our first text, which is Musnet, the Mouse of Monet by, I guess it's Kickliy. And the last name, the only name of the comics creator is Kickliy, and it's Kickliy. Now, I'm not even sure about the origin of that name, and this must be like the mystery person, Andy, because you and I usually don't have a lot of trouble finding information about comics creators when we're preparing for our podcasts.
No, but this one is really, really elusive. Now, I did find a little bit of additional information, but not very much. I saw that this is by Kickliy. So I don't know what the K stands for, but I get the feeling that Kickliy is something of maybe a trademark, because I think, and I know you saw this too, I think on the French edition, the name Kickliy is printed backwards.
Yeah, and it's signed backwards at the end of our edition as well, the English edition. So at any rate, folks, we really can't tell you a lot. I do know that this is the first comic by this creator, or perhaps group of creators. And it's put out in the United States by Uncivilized Books, which is a micro-publishing label headed by Tom Kaczynski. And the imprint that they've just created for children is called OD Books. The letters OD Books. None of this is easy, is it?
No, it's not.
It's like, but I do want to tell you that all you have to do is type in Musnet, M-U-S-N-E-T, and you will be able to find this comic. And it's been, as I said, just this month published simultaneously in France and in the United States. And it's a charming story of a young mouse who has wandered from the Normandy region into Monet's estate. And there he meets a young girl who is a mouse. And basically he's looking for work. He's sort of just wandering through life. And she tells him that there is someone up near Monet's estate who is looking for a helper. And it turns out that it is a squirrel named Remy, who is a noted painter. And what we have are 2 parallel stories occurring simultaneously. On the one hand, we have the story of Musnet, who ends up becoming an apprentice to Remy, and finding sort of a place in this wonderful and beautiful estate where he begins to learn to paint. And on the other hand, we have the story of Claude Monet, the painter, the Impressionist painter, and young children who are reading the text get to understand that basically Monet is the sort of human artist who's sort of revolutionizing the world of painting at this time. And Remy the squirrel is sort of mired in 19th century painting techniques. And in order to find himself as an artist, Musnet has to decide, does he sort of follow his squirrel instructor, or does he start to copy his human sort of model, Monet? And that's really what the story is about. But Andy, I'm not doing justice, I think, to the visuals. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the comic looks like?
Well, and it's, Gwen, it's probably difficult for parents or kids to say this is drawn in a somewhat French style if they've never seen a French comic before, because it is a different style than American comics, especially the more popular American comics with the bold lines and the thick lines. This is what I guess we would call somewhat thin lined art. Not a lot of bold lines, a lot of very lush outdoor scenes, some elegant looking watercolor brushwork, and not the colors on this are somewhat typical of European comics and not so much of American comics that are kind of usually digitally done with. Not that these colors aren't bright, but they're more subdued.
Right. I think that's a good way to put it.
And, I think the artwork is very approachable for a European comic. I don't think Amazon recommends this book for ages 8 and up. I don't think any readers would come to this and think that it's really, really odd looking. It's really not. It's just a little bit of a different style. Again, the line work is a little bit thinner. The colors, at least at the beginning, not quite as vibrant as they might be in something like The Unbeatable Squirrel Girl or something like that. But very beautifully done, very beautifully rendered. The panel layout is very similar to what they would experience from a typical American comic, but it just takes a little bit of getting used to. This is also a larger sized comic maybe slightly larger than most comics for young readers. It's more of in Europe they would call it an album instead of
absolutely
instead of a book form. So I think it's a very approachable book in a lot of ways as far as the art. I think one of the challenges for a young reader would be the pacing of the story. We spend a lot of time with Mus and Maya, and until he finally really gets to the point of the story, like you mentioned with Monet. There's a whole long scene with Mus trying to get work. He's trying to get a job. He meets Remy, and they have a very long relationship as far as, he's trying to learn the art and craft of painting, and Remy is kind of an old, disagreeable squirrel who really doesn't want to teach Mus anything, but he does, and he makes him do these mundane things to earn a living, like, helping him build canvases, making canvases and things like that. The story kind of takes its time in getting to where we really, really want to go, and that is, the Monet and his house and his work. This is really, Gwen, this is only like a 55, 56 page comic, but I don't want to sound negative, but sometimes it feels like it's longer than that.
Well, and I will say that there are 3 other volumes coming down the pike. In fact, in August, Volume 2 comes out, and then I guess there's another one coming out in November and another one in January. And now that the exposition has been set out, perhaps in Volume 2 we'll see things move to more of a conflict and what will happen, because that description that I gave you about Musnet trying to figure himself out. And by the way, that may be pronounced Musnet, but that sounds weird.
You're right.
Yeah. But I haven't heard a French speaking person say it. And so anyway, folks, my dog's name is Beignet, and so that's why I'm kind of sensitive to it because of the NET. And so it may be actually Musnet, which sounds a little bit, or Musnet, which sounds a little bit like Monet. But at any rate, I think things do speed up. But I will also say that that there are certain transitions that happen in Franco-Belgian comics that, to, I think, a beginning reader of them, sometimes it feels abrupt. The transition, very often the transition is between scenes or ideas is put forward with just the word soon. Right. So, and for, I've read a lot of French comics, and so for me, it wasn't jarring, but I could see how it could be, because in sort of contemporary children's comics that are produced for a North American audience, transitions are typically handled more visually, I would say. You know what I mean? In other words, the movement between scenes is or set out by chapters. And so there are some things that are different, but I also want to say, especially for our listeners who are bilingual or are interested in encouraging bilingual education for their children, let me tell you that there is a French website for this comic that has all sorts of interesting activities, including instructions on how children can make paint. And that is part of what goes on in the first volume, because I'm going to start calling him Musnet because I'm beginning to think maybe that's what it is. But anyway, how the little mouse learns to make paint from the squirrel, and the squirrel Remy. And you get to sort of see a little recipe for paint online, and there's all sorts of interactive activities that are all in French, but are pretty easy to follow because it's French written for sort of the elementary school level. And so even I could read it without needing to look anything up. And so I would encourage our listeners, if they get this book and they really like it, not only to look out for the ones that will be coming along later this year, but also maybe to check out the online website. Again, if you just type MUSNET into your browser, you're going to get linked to that French website. So I did find that to sort of be a nice addition to the comic.
Yeah, that's a great point, and that is definitely worth checking out. One other thing that I was going to say that's kind of related to the way that you mentioned, like there are certain things that we'll say later or the next day. I think European comics in general, and again, you've read more of them than I have, but I've seen a lot of European films, a lot of French films, and a lot of times the creator will put you in a scene and just kind of let you soak up the entire atmosphere of that scene. And that happens here a lot. When Moose gets into the actual house and he's being shown like the library and the secret passageway, things like that. We spend a lot of time in those settings, and we're absorbing a lot of different things. And I think that, like I said, that happens a lot in films, but it also translates a lot of times, I think, into the graphic novels. You get to spend a good bit of time in each location. And there are a lot of interesting things to see there, especially, as you mentioned, once we start learning the craft of painting and everything that's involved, the brush strokes and the creating of the canvases and things like that. And of course, any kid that's interested in anything that's artistic or creative is really going to be drawn to this part of it, especially, I think.
Yeah.
And of course, having the animals as the characters is a plus too, because that's a lot of fun.
Yeah.
I think like you. I think this is a good introductory volume, and I think each volume after this is going to be even more compelling. Not that this first volume isn't compelling. I think it is, but I think the rest of it from here on out is really going to be a much more eagerly anticipated volume.
Yeah, and I've been thinking a lot about this. Sometimes when you read a book and it presents such a contrast to what you have been reading that you also notice it more. So as an example, I mean, when you think about some of the books that I've read this month, including, Delilah, Dirk and the Turkish Lieutenant and the follow-up to that, or to the other two books that we're going to be talking about today, they're fast-paced action-adventure, feel very much almost filmic in nature in that respect. Mm-hmm. North American films, right? Where the pacing is just so fast anymore. And I think that for some readers, this text may actually represent a nice slowing down, sort of the slow food movement equivalent of comics, to notice the details, because on some of the pages, nothing else is taking your attention away from that. The story really does, as you say, stop while the reader can contemplate the setting, the feeling, the mood, etc. But I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and it is, again, a really nice trend to see comics creators having their work published simultaneously in North America and Europe, so that readers from all across those regions can have a chance to enjoy the work at the same time, and hopefully, it will lead to more curiosity on the part of North American readers to delve into some French comics, because they really are. It's a somewhat different world, but a really beautiful world. So that would be exciting.
I think so too, and I hope that that young readers will give this a chance, and will accept the challenge. And we're giving you the challenge right here. Read a European comic, and I think this is probably a good place to start for many of the reasons that you mentioned. And
right.
I also hope that adults will take up the challenge too. Gwen Derrick is kicking off another part of the Comics Alternative podcast that focuses on European comics. So I didn't know if you knew about that.
Yeah, I did. I think it's exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting, and I've really gotten into a lot of those lately. So I just love comics in translation from other cultures, from other countries. So I think this is a good one to start with, whether you're a young reader or maybe even an adult too.
And especially since in the United States, Claude Monet's work is something that we really are very familiar with. Impressionism, both there and here, is something that's taught very often in art appreciation classes. It's often exhibited in museums. So parents may have already had the chance to see many of these artworks in person. It might be a wonderful text to read with a child before going to an exhibit, to just give them a sense because in some ways what I really like about this book is it shows the labor that occurs behind the creation of a work of art. And the idea that an artist may be following a style or learning a style only to break sort of the parameters of that style and do something new and different. And I think this comic encourages that kind of creativity. And appreciation of the labor that goes into art making. So I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, me too. Well, let's move on to our second book. And our second book comes to us from Dark Horse. And this is Bird Boy, Volume 1, The Sword of Mali Mani by Anne Szabla. And this is a book actually that started out as a web comic. And we'll have a little bit more to say about that. And Gwen, we had a little bit of discussion about some questions and concerns about this book, but I want to save those for now and focus first on the story and the art. And the way this book opens up, according to a legend of the tribes of the two rivers Nuru and Saburi, I think that's right, a creature called a halfway beast stole the light of the world and hid it in a shell and then swallowed the shell whole. Then these strange, tall, hooded, robed men called the Rook Men, who prefer darkness anyway, protected and revered the halfway beast. And the people of the rivers, however, they cried out for light because they want light. Who doesn't want light? and a warrior named Mali Mani heard their cries. And we're not going to tell you the whole story, but part of Mali Mani's power was lost, and it was hidden in a forest waiting for somebody to discover it. So we jump from the ancient times to the present, which is still looks kind of like it's ancient times, because this is kind of a fantasy story, where a 10-year-old Nuru boy named Bali is trying to become a hunter by learning to be a spear thrower. But his elders think that all he can do right now is really carry a spear, which seems to be about all that he can handle, because he's a really, really little guy. They don't think he's ready to hunt in the forest, which most people have abandoned because of the Rook Men. They patrol the forest. And Bali is certainly not ready for a ritual called the Smoke Walk, which we'll talk about in a bit. But Bali is very, very confident. He has other plans, and he thinks that he's going to be able to do this. So without giving away too much, we learn that Bali is not a normal boy, and that the tribal Nuru leaders are concerned that his size is holding him back. Now, young warriors Bali's age all want to be part of the Smoke Walk, which traces the path that Mali Mani took as he traveled through the forest to face the halfway beast. But Bali is just too little. Or is he?
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. This is a really, really cool quest story. And, it follows several of the tropes that we might recognize from other quest stories. And probably for most listeners, the most famous quest story that they might be familiar with would be The Lord of the Rings. So fans of those books and those movies would probably find plenty to like in Bird Boy, but just on a much smaller scale.
Right. And I will say that just from an artistic perspective, Szabla has an incredible talent for color and line, I would argue. Her line drawings are beautiful. The comic is set up in such a way that things flow very quickly. It's not a wordless comic per se, but there are whole segments of the comic, especially the action segments, where things move very quickly without words. And basically, Szabla has the talent of helping the reader quickly move from panel to panel, even on a complex layout, by the placement of figures on the page and eye contact and that sort of thing. So that I read it I read it twice actually, because the first time I read it so quickly I knew that I had read it too quickly. But I think the point I want to make is that she's a very talented comics creator. You get very drawn into the story. You want to know what happens next, and she takes you through that at a speed that feels almost as if you're right there in the middle of the action. But don't you think? I mean, that was sort of how I read it. I literally had to go back and read it a second time because I was like, okay, Gwen, you can't possibly have read it this quickly. But
no, I did too. I bet I read the thing I know it was in one sitting, and I don't know how much time went by, but not that much. And after Musnet, which is a book that is going to take you a little time to get through. This is a really, really fast book, but you're right. You want to go back because there's so many great things going on. And I really like what you said about the way that it's laid out, and the colors are just absolutely gorgeous. And, every panel is something that really is a work of art. But I like the way that movement is presented. And like you said, so many of these panels are just isolated pictures. In some comics you can see movement, like the artist will draw like little lines or something indicating that somebody's running or a car is moving or something like that. So many of these scenes you just see a picture, and then the character is somewhere else further along in the woods or on the mountain or things like that. So there's so much that the reader has to kind of figure out on their own, although it's not difficult at all. But there are other panels where you do see actual movement taking place. Usually the wind is blowing something or that type of thing. But it's a very unique visual experience.
Mm-hmm. And, Szabla is one of that generation of comics creators who had the opportunity to go to art school and to study comics and illustration at art school. She went to the Rhode Island College of Design and took a number of courses in figure drawing, et cetera. And you really see that artistry in her work, that she's really developed her craft over time. And of course, we also have that situation of the movement of a text from the web and a web delivery system into a book. And on her website, Szabla does say that there were some changes, and I didn't have time to read the webcomic, but those changes are minor. But I think some of those panels that you're talking about that almost feel like stills, I think that may be part of the sort of carryover from what she might have been doing putting maybe 1 or 2 pages up online at a time and then coming back a week or so later. I think that the comic updated every week.
Yeah.
When she was doing it. And so there are sort of some transitions that I think probably were born out of the original medium that the comic was created in. But it's a very fast-paced read. And even though the quest story is familiar, the real testament to someone is if they can take that story and make it like, Star Wars, or you mentioned Lord of the Rings, or, can make it something that's unique and particular and interesting. And I think that she's done that.
I think she has too. And like you said, the story is very familiar. It's very simple. A young boy wants to prove his worth, and by making his way through all the dangers of the forbidden forest. And it's a story that again is very familiar, but in so many ways it almost seems foreign and fresh to us, because we've seen this story before, but we've never really seen it quite like this. And the art is such an important part of that. And as you said, Gwen, this does come from her webcomic, which you can go to online. It's www.bird-boy.com. And I think you can still actually read this entire first volume online. And if you want to do, I would encourage you maybe to read a few pages, but you might get hooked and want to read the whole thing. But it's online, so you could read it there. Now, Volume 2, the print edition of Volume 2, is scheduled to come out later this summer in late August. So
right.
I'm really anticipating the second book because I really, really enjoyed the first one.
Well, and in the tradition of this kind of comic, we are left in a cliffhanger situation, of course. So, you will want to know where the story picks up. That said, we also had an interesting conversation based on some of the art that is actually in the comic. And Andy, I don't know if you want to elaborate a little bit on that, or I can, or we can just chat back and forth.
We can go back and forth. Gwen, if you want to get it started, I'll be glad to jump in because I read a couple of things online that might, and you may have too, that might help.
Right. One of the things that I noticed almost immediately in purchasing the book, and remember, I didn't read this on the web. I bought the book, and when I was walking out of the bookstore, I immediately noticed Inuit art on the cover. The bird boy wears a mask that is very reminiscent of Inuit art that I had seen. But if you read through, you'll also see that there are some things that are reminiscent of art that's found in the Aztec codices as well. And when I saw that, I was interested because I've always been interested in both of those artistic traditions. And as I was reading through the comic, more and more of that artwork became apparent. And I was sort of puzzled because there was no author's note readily available explaining the author's motivation in the print copy itself. And so I, too, did some research online, and one of the things that Szabla comments upon in an interview on her work and her process is that when she was at the Rhode Island School of Design, she took a number of courses in Pacific Northwest art and became very interested in creating a comics world that was a melding of a number of different traditions. And so that was sort of the information that I could glean online. Did you find out some other things about her artistic choices?
Very similar to that. But, Gwen, one of the first things I did was I went to the webcomic to see if she had given any more information there. And I looked under the FAQ and the About sections. And she really doesn't address anything about it, at least that I saw, on the webcomic. And on the webcomic, too, if you're familiar with webcomics, you know that each page, sometimes creators have a comment section and they respond to reader questions. I didn't read every single page on the webcomic, so I don't know if she responded to this, but I read an interview also with Comics Alliance where they asked her about the indigenous influence of Bird Boy. What were your inspirations? And she said it was a little bit of everything from Mayan to Norse to Northwest Native American art. But she mentions that when she was a child, her mom used to read all these different American myths and creation stories.
Right.
It kind of all mixed in together. And she talks a lot about European-inspired fantasy, medieval fantasy. But there's never really a point where she designates where certain things came from. And, I wish that we had been given at least as much information as you and I have seen in the interviews in other places. I wish we'd been given a little bit of something in the book about that, especially for young readers, making them aware of these different influences and where some of the background material might have been included in the first volume. I hope they'll put something in the second volume.
I do too, because, whenever someone uses something from an indigenous culture, or more to the point, whenever someone uses something from a culture that isn't their own, that they have not had a personal experience with growing up or from family, then we can start to wander into that sort of thorny area of cultural appropriation, where someone not part of a culture benefits from the artwork and the ideas of another culture. Now, when we talk about cultural exchange, that's a little bit different. When you have people who are in two cultures that have had sort of equal footing over time, then there's less tension there. But when you're dealing with two cultures where that hasn't been the case, and certainly that has not been the case with European, people who came over to this part of the world and the indigenous people who were already living there, there still is a very unequal distribution of power. And so when you have someone from a majority culture sort of taking ideas and art from another culture, it would be helpful, especially as you say, because this is for young readers, to get a sense for the author's debt to that culture. And again, a lot of the interviews that I read with Szabla, she seems to explain herself quite well, that she's done a lot of research and given a lot of thought to the world that she has created. So this isn't so much a critique of that as it is a critique of communication between the publishers, the author, and the readers. One example that comes immediately to mind of another text that you and I reviewed recently was Zhou Jing's The Only Child. And that entire text is premised upon a very specific cultural experience in China where, because of the one-child policy, many Chinese parents left their very young kids at home to take care of themselves while they worked, and that was just absolutely a cultural norm. So when you read The Only Child and you see that a very young child is sort of on her own and needing to manage herself, if we were to read that without an accompanying author's note providing that kind of context, it might lead to some confusion or to a misunderstanding of a cultural idea that's simply different than the cultural ideas that we might be used to. And so I really appreciated the way that the publisher not only had an author's note in the text, but that in every interview that was related to the text, this fact was mentioned. So any parent who was looking at this book and choosing to share it with a child would have enough cultural information specific to Chinese culture to be able to share the book with the child without, say, perpetuating an idea that, oh, child neglect would be common in China, which is something that if you didn't have that cultural information, you might, especially if you were a child, you might not be able to ascertain what was going on in that respect. So I think this is a long-winded way of saying, and I apologize for that, but I feel pretty passionate about this, that authors could do a lot of good when they make certain choices to put forward things from cultures that either aren't their own or ones that are not necessarily familiar to the majority of North American readers, that they put an author note in there so that we have the chance to get the information we need to give the book a fair reading.
I think you're right, Gwen, and I think it's especially important in a case like this where this is a comic specifically for young readers, and they need to know where those influences came from, not only to be part of diversity, but just for informational purposes and historical purposes too. So, I mean, we're not trying to slam Szabla or Dark Horse, but we really would like to see, I think, some more recognition of the origin of some of the iconography and some of the things that we see depicted here.
Right. And again, to be fair, this is a comic that blends together a number of different traditions. It's just that some of them are very specific cultural traditions, and I don't have the expertise, and I don't know many people who do, to understand in depth the art of the Pacific Northwest, to really figure out what Szabla is taking or what she may be just creating herself, but simply utilizing a style. So that would be super helpful. But as far as the comic is concerned, I, as you said, I'm hopeful that maybe that will be part of the attention that surrounds this comic going forward, and that we'll get a little bit more of that explanation. The comic itself, as a comic, is very well done artistically. So.
Yeah, I really love it. And the only other complaint I had was I wish the book were bigger. It's a small book, especially for somebody my age. Kids will probably be fine with it.
God, it's so funny you say that because I had the exact same thought. I had to go find my glasses, which I don't always need, and it's not that tiny. I mean, let's be fair. It's not like it's a little board book or something, I'd say it's about 8 inches by about 7 inches. But it's definitely something that you could stick into your purse or your briefcase without too much trouble. I actually I had to go find my glasses, so there we go.
Yeah, and the art, and I think the main frustration for me is the art is so gorgeous. I want to see it on a bigger scale. But, maybe, I don't know if the second volume will be any bigger, but we can always hope.
That's right.
Well, Gwen, our final book today is called Poppy and the Lost Lagoon by Matt Kindt and Brian Hurtt. And this comes to us from Dark Horse. And if you're an adult listener and a comics fan, you may be familiar with Matt Kindt and Brian Hurtt. Matt Kindt is a creator that has done some amazing things. And not too long ago, he ended one of his most, I think it's ingenious, series called Mind Management. Mm-hmm. And Brian Hurtt has done a lot of work on a title called The Sixth Gun, kind of a Western horror story. So they're collaborating here. Amazon has this book listed for young readers between the ages of 8 and 12. And Gwen, I think we both agree, this is just a delight.
It is. And, it's one of the things that I found to be so exciting about this book is the style. It's a cartoony style, but within that, despite the fact that it's very cartoony, there are ways in which I don't know how to put it. Let me try and put this one way. There's a way in which that you really get inside the mind and the feelings of these characters without words and just through small gestures and movements that are subtle. And at first you may not even pick up, but as you're reading through the comic, Hurtt's drawing is just unbelievable. And what made it even more interesting for me is when I went online to look at his gallery to see the work that he's been doing over the last 5 years or so in comics. He is a master of so many different styles. So this is a stylistic choice that they have made for this comic. It departs from a lot of the adult comics that either of them have done. It has a sort of light and fun feel to it, and yet there's a lot of depth there. So I think that if you just gave it a sort of a quick look, you might not understand that. You might say, oh, this seems like a pretty light comic. But you start reading through it, there's actually a lot going on there. A lot of details. I think I could read this comic 3 or 4 times and still be picking up little nuances on each page. So,
me too.
It's just, it's sort of like Tintin in a way. I mean, it's very reminiscent of that kind of adventure of the sort of young and smart protagonist who has a companion who's sort of older and has in this case, rather than a dog, it's a cat. And they have these incredible adventures. And it's also really a comic. It's a comic about allegiance to others, and there's just a lot going on here, and it's so beautiful to look at.
It really is, and we'll just give you guys a little brief description of what the story is. It's about a 10-year-old girl named Poppy Pemberton, and she's the granddaughter of a famous explorer named Pappy Pemberton, which you can get confused between Poppy
and Pappy. Yes, you can.
Because they go back and forth a lot. And exploration and adventure run in the Pemberton family. So these days, Poppy is traveling the world with her legal guardian, and his name is Colt Winchester, which is a great name for a guy or for anyone. And as the adventure opens, Poppy and Colt are taking a flying carpet to a New York high-rise apartment to meet a 4,000-year-old Egyptian pharaoh named Ramses. But Ramses, even though he's 4,000 years old, he has the body of an 8-year-old boy. And Colt is an old curmudgeon with white hair and a big white bushy mustache, and we immediately see what kind of character he is. He's complaining about the magic carpet that they're riding on. And he says things like, "Never liked this dad-burned carpet. Blasted rugs got it in for me. Cursed polyester abomination." And he's you love this character immediately because he's such a curmudgeon. But Ramses has this really interesting problem that we won't tell you about here. But he and Poppy and Colt sort of need each other for this problem that they have to work it out. Ramses shows Poppy and Colt a shrunken mummy head, which only speaks once a year, and only leading to some of the greatest of the universe's secrets. So the mummy head gives Poppy and Colt clues to this mission that they're about to undertake. But Poppy and Colt are going to make a lot of other discoveries as well.
Yeah, and one way to think about it, if you've read The Adventures of Tintin, you have Tintin, the adventurer, Captain Haddock, sort of the gruff older guy who's always complaining, right? And you have Snowy the dog, and here you have not only Poppy and Colt Winchester, but you also have this cat, and The cat is called Crumbs, and the cat, in addition to being just its awesome feline self, also is the eyes of Ramses. So as they're going on this adventure, Ramses can see what's happening via the cat. Now, I have to admit that when I read this text, there was a little part of me that said, oh God, here we go with cultural appropriation again. But in this sense, I think that it's handled much more. It's handled with a deftness, and it's a sort of nod, I think, to that sort of world where Ramses actually has a great deal of power in this text, and he will eventually grow back into his adult self. And there is a way in which the children in this text, both Poppy and Ramses, seem so much more together than the adults. And so I think that it's sort of, there's a respectful way of treating this character. And I guess I should just also say that there are some really interesting creatures in this text. And
really? Yeah, aren't there?
Including the Gigantopus.
Yeah. I love the Gigantopus.
I know. It's this giant smiling octopus. After our hippopotamus, I was thinking, what if someone wrote a book with Hippopotamuster meeting Gigantopus?
Oh, that is a great idea.
Yeah, it sounds like a really good, throwdown of some sort. But there are all sorts of creatures. It's sort of like the Delilah Dirks text for a slightly younger reader. The same level of adventure, the same sort of camaraderie between a young woman and a man who's a bit older than she is and a bit wiser in some ways, but in other ways is a bit of a foil. Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I just absolutely adored it. And for parents, you should know that there is an underlying theme in this comic about environmental degradation and about the need to not interfere in natural environments. I don't really want to say much more, I think, Andy, because it's such a fun read, and the discovery of what's going on is part of the joy. So I don't want to take that away from our readers. But there's a serious message behind this text about treating the environment with respect.
There is, and I like the way it's handled. It's not heavy-handed. It's not pedantic. It's very organic, and it really does fit through the course of the story. There is so much to see in this book, and one of the first things that captured me was Ramses' apartment. I could spend hours just looking at all of the really strange and wonderful things that are drawn inside his apartment. And I think kids would it's almost like a Where's Waldo of unusual and interesting things. There's so much stuff on the page. But one of the things that I really like the humor, and much of it is kind of sweet, but not too sweet. And we've seen that, and that's usually not a good thing. It's really not. There's a really nice sequence where Poppy and Colt are on this big passenger ship, and I love this scene where the kitchen staff gets a call for tea to Poppy in the library, and this is a gag that goes on for several pages. I mean, they could have done this like in 2 panels, but it goes on for several pages, and they're funny. They're funny scenes, but they give us a sense of not only the size of the ship and the people in it, but how the ship works and how this world is set up. And it's really, really, it's really ingenious on the part of Kindt and Hurtt. And I also love, one of my favorite parts is the books that Poppy uses for research. Her grandfather's book, Pepperton's Incomplete Compendium of Lost Things, Volume 16. I love that. Or the 13th edition of the exhaustive, languorous, and comprehensive listing of the world's smallest islands with new addendum, mythical marine life habitats compiled and assembled by the Royal Order of Maritime Scientists and Cartographers. That's all the title. That's crazy. It's like one of those, you pick up one of those 18th century books and the title is longer than anything on the page.
It's true. And, one other really nice thing about this comic is there are some pages where when a new device or a new beast or something is introduced, you get one of those wonderful charts where the parts are numbered and then they're described. And so it's sort of one of those books that encourages not only adventurous reading, because this is a fast-paced, fun comic that I think it will build some awesome literacy muscles for kids in reading through it. But there's also those wonderful spreads that I used to love as a kid, where you'd see how something was put together and you would learn its parts. And the other thing I'll just say really briefly is that I don't know if you have the comic in front of you right now, Andy, but on page 36, there's a panoramic view of the city that Poppy and Colt have gone to in their quest. And it's sort of like a combination in some ways of Venice, right, with canals and canal boats, but also of a much sort of more urban city. And in this particular panorama, Colt and Poppy and their guide are traveling in a gondola down what looks like a huge medieval water slide.
Yeah, that is so awesome. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because I love that scene.
And it's just so pretty to look at. It's gorgeous. You just get this whole sort of view of the city down below moving out into the ocean. So there's also, in addition to these sort of very detailed illustrations that are showing how something works, there are these gorgeous panoramas and amazing color. The watercolors in this are just stunning. Brian Hurtt is amazing. That's all I can say.
He really is. Now, I want to point out that the colors, I believe, were done by Matt Kindt, and I think.
Oh, did Matt do the colors?
I'm pretty sure that Matt did the colors. Now, Matt let me just double check here.
Because I had double checked and I thought it was Hurtt. So okay, well, you look it up because you're better. You're faster than I am.
Let me just make sure here. Okay, maybe it's on the.
It was on the Dark Horse website, I thought.
I think it was. I thought it was on the book too. Okay, I'm gonna investigate a little bit more. I know where it is. It's not on the title page, but it is on the title page, but the title page is several pages into the book. Story by Matt Kindt and Brian Hurtt. Oh, I thought he only did the art. Script and colors by Matt Kindt, and then art by Brian Hurtt.
I see. All right.
Now, and again, for people who have read Matt Kindt's Mind Management, he does a lot of watercolor work there that is highly imaginative. But this is a different type of watercolor work that he's doing here. It's similar. It looks similar, but it's hard to describe without having both of them in front of me. But it really is, Gwen, breathtaking art and colors.
It's just fun.
Yeah.
It's a fun comic, and there's mysteries that kids can solve, and there's answers in the back of the comic, so that there's just a lot there for any reader, really, and it would be a fun book either for an adult to chaperone a child through, or for a child to read on his or her own. It's really a sweet book. It
is, and I hope and this is kind of one of those. You hear all the time about, you compare things to things like Indiana Jones, and in a way, it is compared to Indiana Jones because. Like those movies, we're kind of dropped in the middle of a story and it just starts. And that Poppy and Colt have a previous relationship, although we don't really know how it started exactly. But the great thing about that is we realize, hey, we could get earlier adventures and we could get later adventures from this.
Yes, absolutely.
And I hope we get both.
Me too. I really loved it. So.
Me too. This was a fun book. Well, Gwen, that takes us through another 3 books. It's hard to believe we zipped through another 3 books, and these were a lot of fun.
Absolutely. In fact, we sort of did the North American breakneck action adventure comic show today, didn't we?
We really did. Well, and we hope that you are going to check out all 3 of these books. And as Gwen mentioned, 2 of these books, Poppy and Bird Boy, you can get at DCB Service for a 40% off discount. So please check them and take advantage of those wonderful discounts, as well as some of the bundles and some of the other products we have. And when you go to DCB Service or their sister company In Stock Trades, again, you're going to find a ton of stuff. And after you get your comics there, get in touch with us. Let us know what you think about these books. You can contact us by going to our website at comicsalternative.com, and on the right hand of your browser, you should see a tab that reads Send Voicemail. You can click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. Or, if you want to contact us the old school way, you can always call us on the telephone.
I wonder if anybody does that. I'll have to ask Derek.
We got one that I know of.
We've gotten a phone call. Okay,
and believe it or not, it was the wrong number.
Oh. But let's give them the number anyway, because we never know.
Here's the right number if you want to call us. It's 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. And, give us a call, and it would make our day. So you can contact us also by email at the number 2guys@comicsalternative.com, or you can get in touch with us individually. I'm Wolverton at comicsalternative.com. And Gwen, how can we reach you?
Well, theoretically, you can reach me at gwen@comicsalternative.com, but I have to let our listeners know that my university is going through a major email shift. All of my email is sort of pushed through an Outlook site, and right now everything is just sort of in an interesting state. So normally you can catch me at that, but if there's anything you want to talk about, you can also send an email to 2guys@comicsalternative.com until we get our IT issues sorted out. And you can also find us on Twitter, where we announce new content to our podcast and updates to our blog, where we're at 2guys with PhDs.
That's right. And you can also find us on Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Goodreads, and Pinterest. And we even have a YouTube channel. And Derek actually told me that we have, a number of people that follow us on YouTube, which is pretty cool. So, and you could do that, and you could also subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can find us on TuneIn, and you can discover every one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and comics-related commentary on our blog at comicsalternative.com.
And you can also find us on Spotify now as well.
I keep forgetting Spotify. Thank you for reminding me.
Oh, no problem. I just know Derek's like, Spotify, because a lot of our listeners were asking for that. So it's exciting that it's there for them.
That is exciting. Wow. Well, Gwen, it's hard to believe that another month of great stuff has gone by. And I'm looking forward to what we're going to do next time.
Yes, and we can sort of give people a hint that we're going to be talking about at least one book by a very, very famous comics creator for children. So I think we'll just leave it at that.
Yeah,
but
that'll be our teaser.
That's our teaser. But at any rate, until next time, I'm Gwen.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
See ya.